Sandra Quinn. I see some faces in the room that I'm not sure were here earlier. So I'm Sandra Quinn. I'm Associate Dean for Public Health Initiatives in the School of Public Health here on campus. And this is actually a partnership event with the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. Sarah Fishering is sitting right here, who's been our partner at what is called the START Center. That START Center is funded by the Department of Homeland Security. So sort of bringing together the Homeland Security side on our campus, the public health side on our campus, to sponsor this along with the Mid-Atlantic Public Health Training Center. So welcome. If you were with us this morning, you heard me do a longer introduction of Dr. Henderson, but when I did that introduction, I focused a lot on his role in, obviously, smallpox disease eradication efforts. So I want to give you a little bit of a different spin on some of his experience and his contributions. So I had said he was a distinguished scholar at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center for Biosecurity. So just to keep you on your toes, it's not Pittsburgh, it's in Baltimore. So, and in that center really is an evolution from what began as the Johns Hopkins Center on Civilian Biodefense Strategies. And Dr. Henderson really was the leader who began and nurtured that idea and started that center and still plays a critical role. The UPMC Center for Biosecurity, I don't know how many of you know it, but it is really, from my perspective, in interacting with the center, knowing their journal, I think is the leading national think tank, research and policy center in the country on issues of bioterrorism and pandemics. So they will address both infectious disease, as they did in H1N1, but also bioterrorism and other types of terrorism as well. And that center has nurtured, it started and continues to nurture what I think is the premier journal in the field, and that is Biosecurity and Bioterrorism, Biodefense Strategy, Practice, and Science. And that journal really is, for those of us who've worked in this area, is a nice combination of both the research, but also policy, also addressing some of the issues of clinicians, and so it's really been an incredible contribution to the field. Dr. Henderson has been, I think I mentioned earlier that if you Google him, you also find his contributions and things that go beyond the peer-reviewed literature, and so I have to share a couple because I think they're interesting. The PBS series, Avoiding Armageddon. Any of you see that series? I have not seen it either, and it's fascinating actually, and there's a complete website, you can look at all the materials. Our future, our choices on terrorism and the issues we face. So with no further ado, I want to turn it over to Dr. Henderson, who will do some talking and presenting, and then as we have in the other sessions, we'll have time for discussion and conversation.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Sandra. And I must say it's a delight to be here and to see so many different groups working together, or let's say building programs together, because I think this is the future here, is in getting to public health and medicine, the social sciences and so forth. We're beginning to realize that the problems we're dealing with are a great deal more complex than can be dealt with as unitary bundles. And certainly, this certainly indicates it. I should say that I'll tell you a little bit about how I got into the field because I think it's important. I think as we move along, we often forget, how did this get started? What was it like? And where are we now? And maybe get a perspective of why things developed as they did. So I think I think I can validly say we were one of very few really at the beginning of this. The whole effort, which we call biosecurity, which both organisms, strange organisms, or biological weapons. And to go through this with you, and we can get into some of the details of where we are now, but in summary, I'm going to say we've come a long way, but we've stalled. And it's time we got more done than we have. So let me begin here by talking about offensive weapons. And here we know that there was an extensive use during World War II by the Japanese, their Unit 731, and they did distribute a number of different organisms experimentally and operationally, and there were indeed attacks made on cities. It's hard to know how extensive they were, but it clearly was there. After this, there was understandably a feeling that, well, is this a new weapons class? And World War I brought us with chemical weapons. And was this going to be a new weapons class? And people began using biological organisms. So programs began after World War II, and mainly on the defensive side in the UK, US, France, and Russia. And then along came 1972, and this Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention was signed effectively by all nations. To summarize it simply, it was to cease all research on offensive weapons and to destroy any that have been produced. It was pretty much all countries had signed on. There were troubles with it because there was no certification procedure, and that comes a little later. Now, the smallpox eradication preceded all this, and just to say that we had a global program of smallpox. And smallpox, as you know, is really one of the agents that we're most concerned about. But, and just a quick summary, that the global program began in 1967, as we had smallpox in some 43 countries that year. And a conservative estimate was 10 million cases and 2 million deaths. Is the principal cause of blindness in India and a number of other countries. And there were vaccination programs really in most countries, usually using vaccine that was really ineffective vaccine, but there was so many deaths, and when outbreaks occurred, that the political authorities had to do something, but they were doing a lot of ineffective work and with an ineffective vaccine. Now, just to remind you, smallpox, I don't think any people here have seen a case of smallpox, and this is just a typical ordinary case, but it gives you an idea of why the concern about it. This is a little Pakistani boy on day 3, and you can see some vesicles growing here. If you saw this in an emergency room, I wouldn't be surprised many people would think it was chicken pox, might not think of smallpox, but by the time it gets up to day 5, pustules form, the pus forms and form pustules here. He looks very unhappy, and he will have those lesions on his mouth and on his tongue, and making it very difficult to drink or eat. And he can see he's not very happy. They enlarge, as seen on day 9, and day 13, scabs form and they fall off. You can see he's considerably happier at this point. And there will be scars left after those fall off. And we found that more than 80% of the people who've had smallpox had visible facial scars of smallpox. So it was a mark for life. And indeed, it was for many women, it was a mark which severely hampered marriage, but severely scarred women from the smallpox were less desired, and that was a very prominent feeling and comment. This is what we call an ordinary case, but it's a confluent case, and you can see any number of cases like that. You can see why people are really scared to death by this. This is a disease that makes people sit up and take notice. And that is the same man, but he's recovered, and you can see his face just scarred as it is. Not all would be that scarred, but he had pretty extensive scarring. Well, in May 8th, 1980, the World Health Assembly met and declared smallpox eradicated. So it had been more than 2 years since the last case. There had been many international committees that we formed who made independent evaluations in country by country. And in late 1989, that was all assembled. They considered all of the information and decided that smallpox was eradicated and advised that all countries could stop vaccination. So U.S. had stopped routine vaccination in 1972. The reason was that there were enough in the way of vaccine complications that there was question of why are we continuing when we haven't had smallpox since 1949. And the reason was, as in many countries, because they're afraid of outbreak of smallpox coming in and spreading. So here we were, stopped routine vaccination in 72, but in 1980, all countries stopped. And vaccine production stopped. And the vaccine was made, a very crude product. It was took calves, and you shaved them, and then you made little scars on them, and you put little incisions, and then you smeared smallpox virus on it. It grew, and after 7, 8 days, they were sacrificed. The material was scraped off, and that was your vaccine. And it was cowpox that they were growing, which is like smallpox. It's related to smallpox, but it does not act like smallpox, but it was protective of smallpox. Well, things stopped in 1980, and nobody needed laboratories of production of calves at this point, so they dismantled their facilities. And so we had no facilities. The WHO had a vaccine reserve, which originally was a couple of hundred doses of vaccine, but then I guess it was the decision of President Reagan at that time not to put in money into the international organizations as much. They were cutting way back, and WHO cut back by saving money on stored vaccine. And so we wound up with 5 million doses internationally because of that. But then meanwhile, we had the Soviets were active. And this is from a writing by Kentajan Alibekov, who was the ¡2 man in the program of production of biological weapons. And as you note, that the Soviets introduced a 5-year plan to maintain an annual stockpile of smallpox virus, of 20 tons. And indeed, there is a large production plant north of Moscow at Sergiev Posad, where they produced the vaccine, or the virus. This was done on eggs. It'd be easier if you did it in tissue cell culture, but they had eggs. And it really required a pretty elaborate system to grow that number of eggs, inoculate them, harvest it, and so forth, and produce this. But that was set up, and it was running and capable of producing something like varying estimates from upwards of 20 tons of smallpox virus, which was intended to be used in intercontinental ballistic missiles. So as I noted, the Biological Weapons Convention was signed in '72, but there was no suspicion that the Soviets might be up to anything until 1989. So for a long time, the assumption was there was no program. And I know some of our friends in the intelligence community have said, well, we really knew, da-da-da-da-da. Well, my information says they really didn't know. And there was some assurance that that wasn't the case. But in 1989, there was a defector who came across from Leningrad and talked about quite an extensive program which he was familiar with. Later on, Alabek came over and gave more information, and both the British and the U.S. began to get more information about the programs, and it became apparent that the Soviets had a big program. And the program was larger or pretty close to or larger than the nuclear program. I think it was 60,000 people in 50 different laboratories. So it was a big program. And they were doing a number of experimental pieces with this as well. Their top priority, we met with the principals of the Soviet program at the National Academy and talked about it. And they showed us their lists of organisms. They had about 10 different characteristics. Each one of them had a number, let's say a definite, probable, or listed by severity. And they added up all the numbers, came up with a total for the organism. Way at the top of the list was smallpox, anthrax, and then also plague. So yeah, that was confirmation. That was about '94 when I think we met with them at the Academy. There's no question that there was a big program. And there was, in fact, some very good scientists engaged in this program. And as I mentioned, the laboratory. And then with the breakup of the Soviet Union, the laboratory staffs, as much as we could follow them, were cut. Because of money, they cut back the funds. I guess there was they had a sequester a little before we did. And at any rate, they were cut by half or more the ones that we could trace. And many left the Soviet Union to come to other countries. And we've got several in this country, there are a number in Europe, and doing very good work. They're well trained. But we also are aware that there was an Iranian group that traveled to different laboratories there, recruiting for Iran. We never really found out exactly what happened, but there was no question that they had an Iranian recruiting mission going through the laboratories. The medical and public health view was remarkable. And I think many people don't realize just where we were back through the 90s. In public health and medicine, biological weapons, as I was told again and again, are morally repugnant. We will have nothing to do with them. We will do no research that has any relationship to it. And we'll certainly not do any teaching on it. So the major organisms we're concerned about, let's say smallpox, anthrax, and plague, there's very little research, very few people engaged with it or knew anything much about it. At CDC and NIH, there were no staff engaged in this at all. And at DOD, the Dietrich program was there, but it was not very well supported, but there were some good people, but they weren't very many and certainly isolated. In September of '97, I'd been concerned because I'd been for a while at the White House and at HHS, and I was concerned about this program. And with so little interest, what do we do? Well, it happened that the head of infectious diseases at Hopkins, John Bartlett, was president of the Infectious Diseases Society of America that year. And so he was concerned. I talked with him. He was concerned. So we decided why don't we have a symposium at their meeting in September '97? And he could fit us in, he had this president, he could co-opt rooms that might be used by others. So he did, but unfortunately the only thing he could get was quite a large room. We thought, oh my God, we'll have the people sitting in a corner, but we've got to have the symposium. And so we had it, and we were surprised. The room was packed. There were about 2,000 and people, and it was standing room only. There were people sitting in the aisles. And Richard Preston, who's written the books, you know, and Demon in the Freezer and others, was there. And I spoke. And Mike Osterholm, who was in Minnesota at the time, spoke. And it was a remarkable event. And you could hear a pin drop. We went through it. And after that, I could not begin to answer the requests from hospitals for grand rounds, doing grand rounds at hospital after hospital, from Mayo Clinic to New England Medical Center and so forth. Could I come and speak and talk to our people? My simple point was to talking to the people, the people who are sitting there in IDSA, just point to them and say, you know, it'll be a Sunday afternoon, and you got a patient who's having difficulty breathing. He's going downhill rapidly. He's got fever. You've got x-rays. It doesn't show anything. And what do you think it might be? Try anthrax. They had no idea what anthrax would do, anthrax pneumonia. They had no idea what it would look like. And so I pointed out to them that it might be anthrax. You might have a little rash here, and it looks like chicken pox. But you are the people who are going to be seeing the cases first. And here we are, we're spending a lot of money for first responders, police, fire, and emergency rescue. But you guys are the first responders, and you're the first people that are going to know we've got a problem. And you're going to be leading the effort to hospitalization, to get treatment, and so forth and so on. And this really woke up a lot of people. We then, with all the requests for speaking, and then it was said, why don't I create a center? So we did. We didn't have any money. And I went foundation to foundation and had for a whole day with Robert Wood Johnson, for example. And at the end, each of them said, our trustees would be very uncomfortable if we were giving money to anything that related to biological weapons. And so it was turned down right across the board. And we were about ready to give up when the head of Ralph Gomery, who was president of the Sloan Foundation, whom I'd written to, we'd been turned down. But I knew him a bit, and I asked about coming up to talk with him. So I went up, and I got 15 minutes into it. And he said, who's supporting you? So I said, nobody. I thought that was the end of it. He said, good, we'll do it. So then I didn't know what to ask for. I was hoping we'd get a couple of $100,000 maybe to carry us on for a while. And finally he said, you ask for what you think you need. We'll cut it back if it's not enough. So we asked for $3.5 million. But 2 weeks later, we had a reply back, yes. And from then on, we had support from the Sloan Foundation, and where we had tried to get Harvard to join with us, and Columbia to join with us. Maybe if we got 3 universities and go to the foundations, maybe that would impress them. We couldn't get either of them to do anything. And we spent a whole day with Harvard on this. They just finally said, we don't have the talent, we can't put it together. Columbia said it wasn't worth getting together because we don't know we don't have the talent, and that was the end of that. So it was, I only do say all this because it isn't that long ago that this was not an agenda item. This was a senior official that came into HHS, and this was quotations at the time. This person was stunned that the department would even need to be involved with biological. The department didn't regard this as an issue. Most officials thought the preparation was the same as for a nuclear weapon. The FBI was right on the ball and said firemen would go in and defuse the package. That was wonderful. And DOD refused to even work with HHS as we were trying to develop a vaccine. They said, we'll do our own thing. And so communication there was not really very good. But this is, in fact, all written out in a report at the time, and it's still available. But it was true, this is where we were. This is 1999. At that time, money was being provided by the government to defense and to justice. And there was a lot of training going on up at Aberdeen. And the emphasis was police, fire, and emergency rescue. So I went up at one point to see what they were teaching in the way of medicine or public health. The answer was nothing. They didn't have anybody to teach it, and they didn't see that as a problem anyway. So this was really amazing. So we started a program in 1998, and we then, one of the first things we did was to gather together, invite, I think it was 25 people all together from different departments of government, from state and local and so forth, and began and said, what are we really concerned about? What agents? And at that time, the NATO list was, I think, 31 different agents that were priority, quote unquote. Well, that's too many. How many are we really concerned about? And finally, the group came up with 6, which today are the Group A agents. And then, as we looked, there were no papers that you could not find out. What do you do in public health or clinically for these different agents? Well, if you're looking for anthrax, you find stuff buried here, there, and everywhere, but there's not a lot of literature on it. What do you do in the public health sense? There's nothing. So we then began to write papers on this 6 different papers, working with the 25 people who were on this and the people who worked with us. We decided that all papers would be signed off by everybody who wanted to be on it. Otherwise, we would put them on as consultants, and that's what we did. We went to JAMA, because it had a big circulation, 350,000. They wanted no part of it. But there was one senior editor who was moved. And she finally talked him into doing it. So when it's a 10-page, each of these were 10 pages. And she really had a hard time. And at the end, they said, this may have been one of the best things we ever did at JAMA. So it's, again, just to say, we're dealing with something very strange. As you look at what we're thinking about today, realize that so much of this is information and attitudes which have changed fairly recently. We then had a meeting for public health and medical people. It was the first one that had been held. We tried to get 1,000. We got a room for 1,000, and we'd had to put up our own guarantees for the hotel. We didn't have any money. So John Bartlett and I signed contracts on our own funds. And it was November, and the meeting was in February. We had, I think, 27 people about the 14th of January. We thought, oh, boy. And by the time the meeting came, we were oversubscribed. We were totally subscribed a week before, and people were begging for space in the rooms. So the change that took place has been quite remarkable. At this time, Bill Clinton, who had been reading, I think it was the material from Preston, was impressed and designated $175 million, or identified the $175 million, persuaded the Congress to put it up, and got Margaret Hamburg, who'd been Commissioner of Health in New York City, to come in as Assistant Secretary to direct the program. And they began adding some staff. The stockpile began very modestly, and state and local planning with $175 million you don't have a lot of money. It sounds like a lot, but it doesn't buy a lot of vaccine, drugs, people, what have you, and spread out across different states and local health departments. You had difficulty. To give you an example, at that time, with this first paper we put out, we thought it'd be interesting to have an emergency telephone number for each state so that 24/7 coverage, you could pick up a phone on a Sunday and you'd have somebody at the other end. Well, we found there were 13 states we found that didn't have an emergency number. And the interesting thing, I think it was 11 others that knew they had a number. They just didn't know what it was. So this was a state of communication between anything in Central and from the states. So that it was pretty pathetic. You just can't imagine it unless you'd really been there. On June of 2001, we worked with a group down here in Washington to put on what we call the Dark Winter exercise at Andrews Air Force Base. And we're working with Sam Nunn. Sam was very active in the nuclear deterrent issues. And Sam agreed to play the role of president. And we would constitute a pseudo cabinet meeting, but everybody sitting at the table had originally been at least an assistant or deputy secretary in the cabinet. So that they're aware of kind of that level of dealing with things. And we had went through this on a 2-day exercise. We had also the governor of Oklahoma, who happened to played the role of governor of Oklahoma, but he was the governor of Oklahoma. And that added another note of realism when they got into a huge argument as to whether they're going to close the borders or not, and whether he was going to take the National Guard and nationalize it and take it at state level. So it sort of added interesting notes that many of us had not thought about. At the end of the day and a half, Sam Nunn and John Hambry, who'd been Deputy Defense Secretary, said to us that they had no idea that a biological weapon could cause the damage that this one did. And this was when Sam Nunn requested to personally go to the House and the Senate to brief them on this with some of the slides from Dark Winter to tell them what was going on. At that time, I can say I think it was about 6-7 days before 9/11. I was in the Senate with Sam Nunn briefing the senators. So you can see how close some of these events happened at that time. And then came September 11th. And Sunday afternoon, I had a call from the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tommy Thompson, whom I never met, knew nothing, didn't know him. I was a known Democrat, but that didn't seem to bother anybody, at least at that time. And so could I be there at a 7 o'clock meeting? And I said, tomorrow morning? He said, tonight. So I went down to Washington, met with his senior staff, and as he pointed out, there were intelligence intercepts which had come in, indicating there would be a second event, that it would be biological. And at that point, they're looking to what have we got and how prepared are we to respond to this? So we met till nearly midnight that night, and the following morning I called CDC because CDC had all of our smallpox vaccine that had been put in reserve at the end of the vaccination program. They had 15 million doses, and maybe it was produced some time ago, but the question was it any good? So my question I asked was, if we've got an event tomorrow or today, how much vaccine can you send out immediately? That afternoon, the statement came back, well, 90,000 doses. It seems like the diluent had gone bad, And they hadn't been dating, they hadn't been doing repeated examinations of titer to be sure it was holding up. So there we were sitting with 90,000 doses of smallpox vaccine, no production capacity anywhere in the world. And WHO had just done a review, I think it was 1998, a survey of what was in the other countries. And there was perhaps 80 million doses, but I know where roughly 40 million doses of it was, and that was all kept at room temperature, a room being like 102 or 120 in the summer. And I don't think that was very good, but we didn't test it. And just 2 weeks later, we got the first of the 22 anthrax cases. So you can imagine the situation, the chaos that ensued. I was coming down like first every other day, and then it was every day, and then I was down there constantly. And he decided to set up an office of emergency preparedness with an assistant secretary to head it up. And I got tabbed, which I hated Washington. I recommuted for about 7, 8 years, and I did not want to start commuting again. So I agreed to do it for a year while I get somebody in. And it wound up to be about 3 years, but that's another story. But at any rate, there we were. So, as I noted, our priorities, we were looking to smallpox and anthrax, recognizing that we got antibiotics for smallpox, for anthrax. It would be very useful for tularemia, almost certainly. And the question of plague was another story. I won't go into that, but there's a real question about how effective that would be anyway. And then with aerosols, there had been modeling done of what happens if you release it as a cloud over Washington, and a cloud of particles, and the numbers of casualties would be hundreds of thousands. And that certainly got everyone's attention. And smallpox added another dimension beyond anthrax in that it could spread. Whereas anthrax does not spread from person to person, smallpox does. And this made smallpox absolutely our #1 priority, and we had to be prepared for that. We had met with a couple of companies about producing smallpox vaccine back in 2000, when it became apparent that we needed to get more vaccine. And we got a PERT chart on it, and which showed that doing everything in step, we could have more vaccine coming out in 5 years. And that didn't seem to be quite meeting our needs. It was frightening. And we look at it, to 75% of the population we figured was susceptible. 45% had never been vaccinated at that point. And a number of those would have waning immunity of the others. So we figured that we probably had 75% of the population probably was fully susceptible. The world population was really not better vaccinated, because vaccination stopped there also. So we were really looking at a global catastrophe, potentially. As I mentioned, there were no vaccine manufacturers. The amount we had in storage, I mentioned 15 million in the world. And the ready for shipment was 90,000 doses of vaccine. And we had limited quantities of bifurcated needles, but we found we could certainly reuse those with sterilization. So the question was what to do at that point. We needed vaccine. We told the secretary we ought to lay in 40 million doses. He, very soon thereafter, got caught in a television interview process, and quite alarmist, and they said, Mr. Secretary, what are you doing, da-da-da-da? And he said, I will have a dose of smallpox vaccine for every individual in this country. Well, all of a sudden, there was a commitment for 300 million doses of vaccine, far more than we thought was justified at that point. But at that point, nobody seemed to worry about it. And so we thought, well, let's go with it. If there is smallpox in other countries and they don't have vaccine, they're going to need vaccine from some source. And we knew that at the time we went into in the Gulf War, we had upwards of a request from upwards of 50 million doses from the Arab countries who were concerned that if we going into Iraq, that there would be smallpox and they would need vaccine. So that was just a preliminary of what we would have if we had, let's say, another country, whether it's France or Brazil or Kenya. We were going to have problems. So at that time, I told you about making this on calves. And we thought, this is a terrible way to do this. Can't we do it in cell culture? And it hadn't been done commercially in cell culture at that point. We also had problems. We needed purification of the vaccine because as we cloned it, it had 6 components. And then we even got to the point of saying, could we, in a pinch, do this in general virology labs? What do we do? We're back to the wall. What happens if we have smallpox? And we got only a limited amount of vaccine. And we did come to one conclusion, which we never published it, but for obvious reasons, that we would be doing arm-to-arm vaccination, back as it was done in the early days. You vaccinate one person, then you wait, say, 7, 8 days, you take the pus from that one and vaccinate 7 or 8 more, with all the risks that are involved of hepatitis and AIDS and all sorts of other things. But what else could we do? And this was back to the wall. This was all we had to go with. At that time, I had a stunning idea. And that was, there's one man who really was a tough son of a gun, who knew vaccines and knew production. And his name was Phil Russell. He was a major general, former major general in the Army. And Phil was at that time consulting on several new vaccine production plants in developing countries. And so I talked to Phil, and he came in reluctantly. It was a, shall we say, a colorful conversation, as Phil can be. He came aboard and looked at it, and he said, here are the tickets. I'm not going. So for 3 years, we worked on this. In 18 months, we had 300 million doses of vaccine. So it was fortunate. He was a real hero. So the question of, well, how we use the vaccine is a balance of risk. And this is a question of preliminary vaccination. Do we do it? We have to look at the probability of smallpox being used as a weapon. I think we were in general agreement that it was unlikely, just because of the difficulty of obtaining the smallpox virus, difficulty producing it, difficulty disseminating it. But if somebody put all that together, it could be potentially catastrophic. If we didn't have vaccine. But if we had vaccine, based on the experiences we'd had in the global program, we could stop it. And we stopped some really major importations at large scale and did it very quickly with what we called surveillance containment, finding a case, vaccinating around a ring vaccination. But balancing this was, if you do, what if we were to do vaccination on a large scale, we're going to get adverse reactions. Now, as I say, if we had outbreak control, the smallpox does spread slowly. The patient only transmits the infection when he's got a rash. So you can soon find out who his contacts are. There are people who've seen it when he had a rash. They're mostly in the home or hospital. And that was the pattern of European importations. So that if we could focus on that, we're not looking at school programs or work programs. We just didn't see that because these people who got smallpox took to bed straight away. And they weren't wandering around, contrary to TV documentaries or TV shows. They go to bed. And so this, in fact, we could do fairly well in the outbreak control. And if you give the vaccine, the vaccine is active within 3 to 4 days. So this is a unique vaccine, very effective. But we had adverse reactions. And this was the data from the period 63 to 68, and data that we'd gotten at CDC. So per million people, you get 3 cases of post-vaccine encephalitis, which can be moderately serious. We'd have people who had immune deficiency disorders. At that time, it was 1 per million who had come down with this. Now we'd probably have more because we'd have more people with AIDS and potentially more immune deficiency. Eczema vaccinatum, it was about 12 per million. Some of them would get in trouble. Most of them could be treated with vaccinia immune globulin, and then there's a question of, did it cause myopericarditis? That is an inflammation of the pericardium around the heart. I'm not going to talk about that right now. It's really one of the complicated stories, and a lot more has been made of it than what it really is, but let's leave it there. The problem was there are serious complications that could occur, and we would expect 1 death per million vaccinees. Well, that isn't too bad. You'd say, well, it's not too bad. So we do 10 million people, we got 10 deaths. And if you've done a large vaccination program, you would have many more than 10 deaths ascribed to it. Just that's the way it goes. And the headlines will be, another person dies, da-da, da-da, da-da. So trying to run a mass vaccination program just didn't seem like it was a good idea. Besides which, as I say, I think we felt we could move quickly enough to stop the spread of an epidemic once it got started. So through 2003, we had a huge debate. We had, I had people coming to the office, the pilots, nurses, the first responders, union after union demanding that they be vaccinated. And then the Vice President and the Homeland Security Committee got involved. And, well, I'll give you just a brief bit, a kind of curious event. Vice President Cheney himself was very much involved. And we sent white paper after white paper explaining why we didn't think this was a good idea. And the Homeland, his people kept coming back, no, and this and this and this. So one morning, one afternoon, I had a call to be at Andrews Air Force Base the following morning. I said, for what? And they said, we can't tell you. And I said, where are we going? We can't tell you. So I said, when are we coming back? And I said, you'll be back by nightfall. So we went out to Andrews Air Force Base, and here's Air Force 2. And there's Dick Cheney, and what's his name, his assistant, Scooter Libby, and another person. And I was myself and Phil Russell and one of my people. And off we went to CDC. Secret event. I thought this was wonderful. So we landed in Atlanta, and the usual motorcade came up, one car after another, and CDC sits in the far edge of the airport. So as we drove in, what did we find? Police at every corner, stopping traffic. So we just whipped through. It's really secret, I tell you. I mean, this is really a secret mission. Who would know this? Got to CDC, and there's a little knot of people who are interested in photographers and what have you. Yeah. It wasn't secret at all. It was unnecessary, sort of Mickey Mouse stuff, but that's neither here nor there. We finished up the day, CDC, and we were totally in agreement on the whole thing. It's no question. We got back. got off at Andrews Air Force Base, got off the plane. Phil and I and the other person with us, she congratulated each other because they sort of listened to everything we had to say and seemed to be in agreement. Cheney's usual expression was, And that's all I can remember in quotations. But we thought we must have persuaded them. So I got home, and my wife said, be in there first thing in the morning. There's a press release going out. We're doing a national vaccination program. I couldn't believe it. So I wheeled in early on in the morning, and here are two of my staff there. They're drinking coffee. I said, what the hell goes on? So they just called. They canceled the press release, the conference. I said, how the hell did this happen? I couldn't find out. For 6 or 8 months before I found out. This is actually written up in the book on Cheney. And it seems that Bush had said no. And I thought, wow, how did this happen? Well, actually, I'd been with the president and the secretary flying to Pittsburgh at one point for a speech that the president was going to give. And on the way back, I sat with he and the secretary and myself, and he asked questions, really a very good set of questions. It was very sensible. He nodded, asked more questions. There were no notes taken. And this was 6 months later that he vetoed the mass vaccination program on the basis of that contact we had. So it stopped to a degree. Cheney was terribly persistent, so we finally agreed. All right, let's see what happens if we do first just the high-risk people, hospitals and public health people. Add that up with 400,000 people. If they added first responders, we'd have 10 million. So we said, well, maybe we'll just start with the highest risk people. And the result of that, we had dynamited the program inadvertently. But I was aware of the fact that people didn't really know what a vaccination reaction looked like. So we'd managed to get a series of pictures of a vaccination reaction at 6 different points in time, so you'd know what it looked like. And what do we do? Put on the back, and there was a man by the name of Henry Kemp out at Colorado who had taken a lot of pictures of complications. So on the back of it, we put the complications of vaccination. Pictures of people with vaccinia necrosum and so forth and so on. Well, they made a nice little panel. You could put them up on the bulletin board, and most everywhere they wound up with the front and then the back. And a lot of people looked at this and said, no way, I want no part of this. And particularly in the hospitals, the legal people wanted no part of vaccination. And so that collapsed at 39,000 vaccinated. And they were too well informed that that was what it was. So the program collapsed. There was no smallpox virus found in Iraq. Vaccination complications were there. We never did solve the question of liability for vaccination. That remained in attorneys, get very complicated on this. We never got that one worked out. And then the military reported case of myopericarditis, which was very strange indeed because we'd gone all the way through 63 to 68. There weren't even reports in the literature about it. And here they are turning up a fair number of cases. And John Grabenstein was in charge of vaccination for the military. John, tell me what a case looks like. He said, let me tell you. He said, somebody comes in about a week after, they have a little fever, and they sort of got a little something on the chest. And if they lean forward, it might be a little more. And so they would get an EKG. And the EKG would show that there were some changes. And I said, good God, and we thought about it. What would we have done in the 1960s if somebody came in, a young person, and had this, reported this? We'd say, why don't you take a couple of aspirin and go home? If you don't feel better, call me. And he agreed that that was about the magnitude of it. And indeed, this became a huge bit of myopericarditis, and oh my goodness, what a problem this will be. And it was those who were working in research laboratories who wanted us to keep the smallpox virus so they could keep going with studies were particularly happy to see this, and it was a cause for trying to develop a new vaccine which would have no complication, da-da-da-da-da-da. At any rate, the program drew to a close. So our stockpile today consists of the cells that we had produced, 170 million, in Campus Baxter, done in neuro cells. We got 85 million doses of the calf lymph, the old calf lymph vaccine produced in '78. And that's a weird story, but why we have it, I'll leave that for later. And we've got a new vaccine, which is, does not cause reactions because it's not a replicating vaccine. We've got 2 billion doses so far. It's costing, what is it? It's 40, I think it's $40 per 2 doses. It has a contrast to $3 from the Canvas vaccine. And it requires 2 doses 30 days apart, and it doesn't reach a maximum protection till 42 days. Can you imagine being in the middle of a smallpox epidemic and saying, now we can give you this vaccine, which, and if you don't get any contacts for the next 4 weeks, you're okay. I mean, you won't have any protection. But at the end of 42 days, you'll have good protection. And you're in the middle of an epidemic. Or we can give you this vaccine, which has a Canvas vaccine, which has some complications associated with it. They're very mild, but you're going to be protected within 3 to 4 days. I really can't see how we're possibly going to use Imvamune at all. And it's about a $500 million, maybe a $600 million expenditure. Let's leave it there. Production capacity is supposed to read in the U.S. We have none. 1950, or 1980, we'd worked with CDC and decided we would have to develop a vaccine production facility, which it could be an emergency production of vaccine. And so, off and on, let's say contractors being contractors, and finally, the plant just got built within the last year or two. And you can see how much of an emergency we assigned to some of these things. It has yet to have the vaccine approved for use, but hopefully we will have the possibility of getting emergency vaccine in the U.S. Other than that, there's only one manufacturing plant in the world today capable of producing a live vaccine, and that's in Japan, Kumamoto, Japan. And they produce a vaccine, which is a very good vaccine. It's a different vaccine, but very good. And that's all we have worldwide. So, needless to say, I think a number of us have been rather concerned about this. But it certainly doesn't seem to have moved the production capacity very rapidly. So, we're now 11 years since the World Health Trade Center. We've given federal funds for state and local preparedness. Communication systems are certainly much better. We have a diagnostic laboratory capacity, which is really quite good, but in the last 5 years, they've been cutting back so severely that many of them have had to discharge people, and some of the laboratories have had to close. Hospital preparedness studies or programs have been done, and all hospitals have now programs for emergency handling of casualties, but there's still not a area-wide program so that you can take casualties from wherever they are and know how to allocate them across. We have vaccine, antibiotics, and so forth in a stockpile. But, ask the question, suppose we have 8 cases of smallpox. diagnosed today in Hagerstown, Maryland? Do we have an agreed upon, written, rehearsed overall strategy that national authorities, state authorities, and local jurisdictions are going to say, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to do it, this is our strategy, this is how bad smallpox is? We have some groups that are risk groups, and that would be people who are likely to be handling patients or dealing with patients. Have we decided who they are? We decided who are the risk groups? We're going to get all ERs and IC unit people? How about public health people who may be investigating? How about police who may be escorting patients? Are they included? Have we got an idea about that? How are we going to, if people are going to get screened, what methods are we going to use to rule in or rule out contraindication for vaccination? Whom are we going to vaccinate because it's a balance of risk and benefit? Do we have a policy? Suppose that there's an outbreak in Spain and they want vaccines. France wants vaccine, Switzerland wants vaccine, right around, other countries want vaccine. What are we going to do? We don't have all that much vaccine. What are we going to tell them? This could be a dramatically difficult problem with us sitting on the vaccine we have. And most of them have none at all. We know there are only 10 countries that have enough vaccine to handle their own needs. And you might try the internet and see a CDC smallpox emergency response. The only things I can get were last updated in September 2003. One or two things have happened since then, and there must be some other stuff somewhere, but if you go to CDC, smallpox emergency response, you're referred back constantly to this, and it's last updated 2003. Should we be concerned? And the better question, as far as I'm concerned, do I sleep better than I did in October 2001? And I don't. We've got a lot to do yet. Thank you. And with that, I will conclude.
All right. Thank you. So we can take questions, and if you have a question, it would just help since it's there are a lot of us here. Just stand up when you ask your question so everyone can hear you.
Let me sit down here.
You can sit down, they can stand up.
Dr. Henderson,
Yes, sir.
You mentioned early in the presentation about the former Soviet program.
Yeah.
What is our national knowledge about the extent to which those stockpiles were totally destroyed or not? And we talk in the nuclear area about loose nukes. Are there loose bugs out there that terrorists might be able to get their hands on?
We do know that the stockpile that the Russians have, they have provided an inventory of what they have. The laboratory is visited every 2 years by an independent international group, and they've agreed, and this is CDC as well, to undertake only those protocols and research that are approved by an independent committee. Looking at what they've done, what they've reported and so forth, I think they've adhered to it. The question is that all there is? And how do you know? And from everything we've been able to gather, we don't think there is anything, but then one of their biggest research programs was going on for years. And those who worked in the laboratory, if they're going to go on holiday, they kept them for 2 weeks in the laboratory, not working on the program, just in case they developed smallpox. Then they went on holiday. So even they were vaccinated and so forth. They were that cautious about revealing anything. So the revelation of how this was found out is another story, but they were awfully good about keeping this confidential. So we don't know, certainly I can't say for certain, that there isn't 2 or 3 other stocks that they might have had and put away. Well, they can say the same thing about us. Other countries, there is suspicion, there have been suspicions that there was a Korean program, North Korean program. There's been suspicious enough in terms of what was done that we think it's possible that they may have had it. May have it now, we just don't know. There are other countries been rumored to have it. I think France, there's a list that came out. I was never persuaded by much other than the North Korean rumor that this was, that was there. And there may be others, but I think if it were to be used, I think that this is one of the reasons we wanted to have the destruction of the smallpox virus as a formal act, and to make this very public, that even having the virus in possession of anybody is a crime against humanity. And it isn't going to stop it, but it might deter.
Questions? Other questions?
Dr. Henderson, what is your take on the recent reports that the UK, when they first purchased, invested about $80 million in smallpox vaccines, that they've now downgraded that threat, and now people are saying that idea was far-fetched and they wasted that money?
Can you just restate so everyone can hear?
Oh, sorry. I was just questioning the UK's investment in the smallpox terror threat back around 9/11, and now scientists are saying that that investment was a wasted investment. That may have been a far-fetched idea, that this was a terror threat.
Well, it's a good question. I think it's the question that was asked at the time, and you still ask now, is how likely is an event to occur? And there are a number of events that have happened that came as a complete surprise. I think the rationale for feeling it could be done is this is certainly very plausible to produce the organisms. Certainly the response that the U.S. made following the outbreak of anthrax, which was 22 cases, 5 deaths, which is nothing. And yet that really upset the country. I thought, oh, what a reaction there was. You do this in 2 or 3 places, you can imagine there'd be real chaos. So that in trying to decide priorities, I can understand if we haven't had it, what are you going to do? Well, then they haven't had a hurricane like Sandy for how many years in the New York area. So we need to be prepared to some degree. I think what we've come up with so far is not totally prepared. It's never going to be totally prepared. We've got to be broadly ready to counter or deal with a lot of casualties. And we ought to do what we can to make sure that a virus doesn't escape. When the H5N1 event happened and we got that, we were very worried about that and maybe getting out of a laboratory. We still are worried about it. Not in this case, not necessarily that people would want to do it, but there are laboratory accidents, laboratory escapes. If we had a virus like H5N1, which you've got a 50%, 60% case fatality rate, spreading like influenza, whew. And yet, so we really, there's a lot we need to do to be better prepared to deal with catastrophes. And it's not just terrorists. It's also stray viruses or bacteria, what have you. And how much money do you put into it is it's a judgment call.
Stand up.
Sorry. Dr. Henderson, to follow up on that with the H5N1, what is your take on the controversy surrounding the publication of the virus in the journal of Science and whether or not that should be publicly available information?
You ask a very difficult question. Yeah, I've been very much involved in discussing this. In looking at it realistically, the problem I see is how do we ever police this? How can we have anything that is, let's say, a national policy that can be policed? These laboratories are all around in different countries, and trying to get something like a BSL-3 or BSL-4, a qualification at this point, it's a very expensive laboratory, hugely expensive. I think in many of the countries, they'll choose to go ahead and work with the virus, whether or not that they are that secure. It's just hard to know what we can do. And I must say, I came down on the side, finally, saying that what I think we need to do is make sure that there is a very extensive public debate. That those, our colleagues in particularly laboratory sciences, have an appreciation of just how difficult this could be and what a major problem would be, and that whatever they're doing would be to take due heed and care, that if anything begins to come up, we can try to move quickly, but I'm not sure it's going to go very quickly enough to really make a difference. But it's been difficult to see what can we do practically that's going to stop it. At the same time, well, what do we got now? We got an H7N9 out there in China with, what do we got now? Four cases, 3 deaths or something like that. Deaths in pigs. Some birds are said to be infected, but that's unclear. Now, what do we do about that? And you look at it, it's got a potential. They're giving us a lot of information, and I think that this is much more open than it was. But I think we've got to look to better ways to produce vaccine faster, better, because that's really, at this point, very hard to see what else we could do. So it's a very nasty problem.
Hold on, back here first, Monique.
Hi, Dr. Henderson. It's an honor to speak to you. I've read a lot of Richard Preston, so it's really nice to see you in person.
I'm real.
You are. So my question is just about, I guess, how do you kind of make the decision to prioritize between like smallpox and anthrax pathogens that we know, and possibly like new emerging diseases that we haven't seen before? You know, how do you make that decision on what we give priority to, and how we can prepare for those things, and especially with smallpox and anthrax, are we making plans like on what we know from strands that we know, or are we taking into consideration the fact that these programs that might have been shut down, where they were working on making the viruses hotter, as we would say, and more, I guess, infectious, and you know, are we taking all those things in consideration, and how do we kind of like appropriate funding to each?
Well, it's a very difficult job to know how to apportion funds. We're limited in what we can do. Personally, I feel we do have, with they call it the ACAM 2000, the vaccine we have a vaccine which can stop the transmission of smallpox, and I think we can control it. Are we going to go ahead and get a vaccine that is going to have no complications at all? Well, we're hoping we won't ever use it. And I don't really see, I can't justify the research going into developing a better vaccine for what? But then we really went through a priority system when we looked at smallpox and anthrax. There's a basis on what were the Russians coming up with. Plague was the third one that they were concerned with. There's been a good bit of discussion about this. Is how communicable plague really is. And I think the current evidence is that it's not very. We do have antibiotics that at least could squelch it in significant part. So that we've got this much. There's been a look at a lot of different agents. A lot of them may do a lot with salmonella or shigella or goodness knows what. And I think the feeling of a broader preparedness of early detection and an ability to treat large numbers of casualties is going to require training, and it's going to require planning on the part of hospitals. Communications, there are communication centers now in most large cities, or practically all large cities. So we've got some communications extant. Could we do more? Yes. Do we know what we're going to do as follow-up? We haven't really worked that out yet. So that a number of things have been done. How much further should we go? And that's constantly a concern, and the group that should be dealing with this, BARDA, is trying to come up with judgment calls. Let me just leave it there because this is very difficult, and various of us have different views about it. But I think we need to be prepared in a general sense. I'm very much in favor of seeing every emergency room in a hospital equipped with an FTE, infectious disease person, who is educated in possible odd diseases. We're going to find that's where we're going to find out first. A lot of money has gone into something, well, it's sensing devices, let's put it that way. And that has been a colossal waste of money. I remember when it was put up in the first place. I know the justification. The justification was very simply, we've got all these EPA air samplers, and we simply put up stuff. We can collect plates, and then they can be tested, and the president can reassure the people that we really are doing something. But at that time, the fact was, as we all admitted, this wasn't going to do very much. And but it was more a reassurance for the country that something was being done. Now it's gone into, I think it's a $4 billion proposed expenditure. Total waste, but never mind. So I think that we need to be careful how we're spending it. Meanwhile, I think one of the best things we can do is to strengthen the state and local health departments, and so that they're ready to respond. Because no matter what we do with bringing in military, National Guard, Northern Command, so forth, they have to work with a domestic structure. And people know their area. They need to have something that gives you the fabric to work. And certainly we need that sort of backup, but they can't do it themselves. So that what are we doing instead? We're cutting their budgets in the craziest thing. And meanwhile, talking about sampling devices. Then there's something called, in fact, we call it, what do I call it? Swatch. We call it BioSwatch. For the Swiss watch, as a swatch. It looks like a watch, but it really doesn't have much inside. So we have BioSwatch and we have BioNonsense. 2.0. And BioNonsense is collecting huge amounts of information about syndromic surveillance stuff. And I'd met with them so many times and just said, please just give me one example where this turns up an outbreak and you've done something about it. And over again, well, you know, we could do that. I said, yeah, we could do it. Why don't you demonstrate it for us? Well, it gives us valuable information. Great. Well, how does this really work? Because you're looking at diarrheal disease, you're looking at respiratory disease, you're looking at this and this and this. I think you get a good infectious disease doc ready to go to the emergency room at any time and who is up to date on what it is that looks like a biological agent and who can be there. And all you need is one FTE to do that. And I think that would be the way to go. And I think it would be a lot cheaper than BioSwatch. So that, I think, is a really important thing that might happen. I think the evidence is whenever we come up with new agents, new diseases, it's always been a physician or somebody in a clinic who finds they've got a couple of strange cases and calls for help. When West Nile came in, it was a woman in New York who called in about a couple of cases, and the woman in charge of infectious diseases went out on a Sunday and looked at it and said, this is encephalitis. In fact, I think it might be St. Louis encephalitis. Well, it is very closely related to it. And then they came back and found that there were 20 cases at that point in the hospital, but not being diagnosed. But nevertheless, they got it at that time, and you had Marcy Layton, who was the real heroine on this, who'd gone out, detected this, they got the virus, and we were on our way. And I think this has been the experience we've had with a number of cases. And how did Ebola and Marburg come to attention? How did you go down the list? And it's usually one person or a physician or a health person who looks at it and says, this is strange, and I think we ought to have another look at this. And this is much better than bio-swatches and bio-nonsenses. And it's not all that expensive.
Yes, sir. Stand up.
I'm a little tall, but hi. Dr. Henderson.
No, stand up so they can hear you.
Given, you mentioned before about previous research, you mentioned not being worthwhile going into a new smallpox vaccine, but given the amount of complications that are associated with the original, and you've got a rapidly aging population, you've got increased immunocompromised populations, people with eczema, psoriasis, I wouldn't be able to take the vaccine, for instance. How does that, would you still think that there's no cause for a new vaccine?
Well, yeah, I think your argument is why aren't we working with a more attenuated vaccine, given the fact we do have more people with probably immune deficiency disease or older and more susceptible to complications. Your assumptions that probably there are more people like that, I think that's right. But looking at it on the other side, we're looking at a disease which we think the probability of an attack is very low. Much lower than, let's say, anthrax or plague. I think there's general consensus on that. However, if we did have an attack and we didn't have the vaccine to stop it, it could be a catastrophe. So looking at where we were, once we have the vaccine, at least we can stop it from becoming a catastrophe. And yes, we would have complications more than we would if we had a vaccine that was produced no reactions. But we don't have that vaccine at the moment. It takes a lot of money to make that vaccine. If we want to do something, let's say, what do we need in a stockpile? Say you need 1 million doses. 1 million doses? The 300 million people? Was it 10 million doses we need? Well, with the vaccine we're using now, ACAM 2000, it's about $3 per dose. So 100 million doses is $300 million. But suppose we get Infimune, it's comparable amounts. Multiply that by 15. Ooh, I don't think we're using our money well. So I think we have to accept a certain risk. And we're going to have problems of some degree. And in my opinion, I would think that our money might be better spent rather than chasing down a less reactogenic vaccine for a problem which I think is less likely than anthrax by far. I would like to see us really go at the anthrax problem. I would like to see that as priority, the research, and to put a lot of money into that. But you have to make choices here, and where do you make it? Do we do a vaccine for Ebola virus? And we look at that, and we see how it spreads, and we say, yeah, we could have somebody who spreads Ebola virus, but is that going to spread easily? And it doesn't spread easily. You can go down various ones that you can look at, and this has been done, and you come to it. The smallpox is very high on the list. I mean, there's no question about it. It's the way we rated it, the way the Soviets rated it as well. And anthrax and plague were kind of a second tier, and then you drop down below that. So we can't be prepared for counter everything. Antibiotics will cover a number of things. You do something, a certain amount with isolation, and so forth. But I think one of the key things, if I were looking at it and seeing where we are today and where we were in 2001, I still worry about our biggest problem simply being we do not have an infrastructure at this point. We do not have agreed plans. This is 12 years. And we don't have, all we've got is vegetable soup for an anthrax vaccine. That is unconscionable. So no, I think we've not spent our money as well as we could and should. But I don't really see us expanding further. Now, one of the things that I should take that back and say, the H5N1 does say to us that influenza could be one hell of a problem. And we could put a lot of money into trying to develop a broader-based influenza vaccine, which might cover a number of antigens that we do not now cover or would be a problem, and to figure out a way to produce it in a better way. When I was involved with this earlier, an H5N1 hit, the one thing it seemed to me was priority was to get some vaccine capacity so we could make it quickly. And up till that time, all we had was an egg vaccine. It was just taking forever to make. And you have to get the eggs, and you're trying to get them without, that are pure and that do not have contamination or potential contamination with carcinogenic viruses or what have you. And virtually our whole supply up to that point was done by Amish farmers up in Pennsylvania. And it also looked like if H5N1 got going in one flock, it'd go, whoosh, do the whole damn thing. And we would have no eggs at all. So the idea was can we get this into tissue cell culture? And so that was 2006, I guess it was. That we got $200 million to invigorate vaccine producers to switch to develop a tissue culture vaccine. And I have not been able to follow that closely. I do know Novartis just opened vaccine plant, which I'm told has a capacity like about 150 million doses within a period of 6 months or something like that. And I haven't followed this closely, but it's just opened. And so we should have more than one. We want certainly at least two. And where the rest of the money is gone for the other, I think it was 4 plants or 4 companies that we worked out joint agreements on. But I think that was a move we made, which was a good move. It doesn't seem to have followed very well, but there we are.
So I'm going to give the last question to Clark.
Thanks, Dr. Henderson. First off, I'd like to appreciate your comments about emphasizing that public health preparedness and response, like all areas of public health, starts at the local level and beyond that community. And on that note, you mentioned back to the dual-use research of concern question. You mentioned that there's need for public debate. My question is, in a democratic society like ours, what's the role of communities and the lay public, and in particularly communities where such research is taking place? Share your thoughts on that.
Well, it's very mysterious when you're in Washington and trying to figure out how you get enough money for certain projects as a whole. The state and local health department business I find especially mysterious, because to me it makes so much sense. They had a slow start. I don't think they got as much in the way of support from CDC as they should have early on. That definitely improved, and I think they've got good leadership. They obviously need people. They need resources. They need resources which are, I think, we gave them the money in a way that was different than they'd had. We didn't sort of prescribe so many virologists, so many this, so many that. But we gave them broad objectives, and then to tell us how they'd want to spend it. And that has been very welcome. And the impression I had was they were spending it very well. But it's, as some of them have said, it's the only money they've gotten from the federal government, which they had any real latitude to be able to use the money properly. As you look at Podunk, Iowa, and you look at Boston, Massachusetts, the needs are different. And there's got to be a flexibility, but there needs to be some common objectives that they're trying to reach in a broader sense of output rather than input. And that is, so that money, seeing that go from $1 billion down to, I think, 650 million, this is before the sequester, the real blow. The association has protested this. There are others have protested it, but it's hard to know where to go. To be quite candid, the constituency within the White House has not been particularly strong. That is, in terms of medical public health initiatives. Nice people, good people, but I've been very disappointed in what their productivity. And I would think with Obama as president, I really had a lot of hope on seeing a much stronger state and local health department initiative. And why that hasn't gone through, I just don't know. I would think it would be popular with state officials, local officials. It's certainly, I think the support that various people have given to this have been there, but it certainly has not done well. So I would like to say we ought to keep trying. Before 2001, we didn't even have anything, but getting the $1 billion out there, for me, is really what I felt that was one of the best things I've done in government was to get that money going and flowing, and to see it going well. And I would have hoped that it would have gone much better than it has. Money would keep coming, at least $1 billion, and actually increasing as you get started on a program. It's hard to get them in order and get personnel and get it moving. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes a time, several years before you get there. But But then once you get that in place, that you can build on it very readily. And I think they've gotten to the point, many of them, that they're in a position to accept more in the way of resources and do even more with it. At that time, we're cutting it back. So I'm very disappointed about this.
So I just, for a moment, just because I know there are a lot of you here, how many of you are students? Okay, I know we've got START students, we've got START students, we've got undergraduate public health students, we have graduate public health students, we have nursing students over here, I think. Anybody else?
Basic research.
I'm sorry?
We're both virologists, basic virologists.
Oh, basic researchers.
Biodefense masters.
Biodefense, okay. I asked that question because I think part of what you're hearing through these three talks, and certainly this talk, is Dr. Henderson talking about from smallpox to polio to bioterrorism, that these are interdisciplinary efforts that are not going to rely on any one, be it public health, be it law, be it biodefense, be it virology. They're not going to be solved by any one discipline. And it's a favorite saying in public health. There's no public health problem that's going to be solved by any one discipline. But I think for the three you've heard him talk about today, you not only hear that it takes a team that brings different perspectives and visions and skills to the table and knowledge, and it takes a team that also understands that science and policy are intertwined and can inform each other sometimes well, sometimes not as well. But it also takes a long-term vision and commitment. And so many of you are going to be the future when Dr. Henderson and I and a few others of us in the room are going to be, stepping back. And you are going to be the future leaders in these areas. So I hope that today that you were inspired and learned and saw opportunities perhaps that you haven't seen before. On behalf of the School of Public Health, on behalf of START, I want to thank you for this session and more broadly for sharing the day with us.
Well, I should just say a word about the smallpox program and the personnel. We had, I think it was 40% of all people under the age of 40, under 40, many under 30, and they were a young group. I think we constituted 1% of the whole of WHO, and very few. We had, and this is where the comment came, that you had a lot of young people who didn't know it couldn't be done. And this was true. And they went out and solved any number of problems. They weren't just physicians. They were from all different areas. And so many of these people have picked up from that and continued on in careers in this. Some of them MDs, some of them PhDs, some of them in health departments and other positions. But it's been amazing. And I think it was the lesson was there's so much that can be done that is so satisfying and so exciting that you just hate to leave it.
So, thank you so much. There is a small reception out in the main ballroom.
Where the posters were.
Where the posters were. So please join us.